Right now, there's a huge asymmetry of information regarding Cardano and its eUTxO smart contract system. It's a little like the early days of computing when I was a kid. Anyone in the previous generation of typewriter users could have easily focused on the print quality of a dot matrix printer versus a good typewriter. Little did they know that home computers would take us to a paperless future where ink wouldn't even be required. Cardano is in the same place. They don't yet realize that Cardano won't even need the ink. Ready? Let's go. I hate to say this because it's going to sound a little brash, but man, does it feel good when you know something the rest of the world doesn't know yet. Today, a working product in Cardano, inside the Cardano ecosystem. Let me say that again. A product that's working right now, a platform that is currently up and running, published a Medium article explaining exactly how the smart contract underlying their platform works. It's beautiful and concise, both the article and the actual Plutus smart contract underlying the platform. The article does what you expect someone to be able to do when they truly understand what they're talking about, and that's explain something on multiple levels of sophistication. And the smart contract does exactly what you'd expect if you've been following our discussions on this channel around Plutus. It utilizes distributed UTXOs that contain NFTs so that you can distinguish the legit UTXOs from the fake ones. We're going to go through all that, but first, we're going to hit a few news items. First up, we're seeing reports that Unstaked ADA is now at an all-time low of under 8 billion for the first time. This is ADA that hasn't been delegated to a stake pool. That means a huge proportion of the ADA out there is now delegated to stake pools. I think this is a direct result of Cardano just having a superior staking system. Nobody else has this system where you can stake on a ledger, a Trezor, you can have your holdings on a hardware wallet, and you can stake to a stake pool that never has custody of your Cardano, can never lose your Cardano for you, and can't make a mistake and get your holdings slashed by the protocol. These are things that Cardano's two biggest competitors by market cap can't say because they're both Casper-based systems. So these things can happen on those blockchains. They can't in Cardano. This is going to be a huge advantage for us forever, as long as our competitors stay on the systems they're on. Cardano's always going to have this gigantic advantage in terms of the ease of use of our staking system. Something has finally happened that I think we always knew was going to happen. And that's that the ecosystem has gotten so big, they can't even fit the logos on the ecosystem maps anymore. Look at this. I mean, look at how many DeFi projects there are. Look at how many, and these aren't even the NFT projects. These are just the NFT tools. Look up here. These are just series of NFTs. Dev tools. This is how many wallets we have now, or things that at least fall under the category of wallets. This ecosystem is just getting bigger and bigger, and we're only weeks away. We're only weeks away from the Plutus application backend. We're not months away. We're like weeks away. This is a Medium article published today by SpaceBudz about how their SpaceBudz Market works. This article was a big turning point for me in Cardano. Sort of in my experience with Cardano, reading this article was a big turning point for me, and I'm going to explain why in just a second. But you probably already know that the SpaceBudz Market is a marketplace platform for trading SpaceBudz on Cardano that runs on smart contracts already. And in the October mid-month development update, they kind of, without naming SpaceBudz, they kind of explained how smart contract-based platforms could be running on Cardano already, even without the Plutus application backend being released. That'll happen in a couple of weeks, like we've already mentioned. But this article is one of those really elegant and concise pieces of communication that you can tell comes from somebody who really understands what they're talking about, because you can go through and read this article. It's only an 8-minute read, knowing nothing about functional programming or Haskell or Plutus, and get a good idea of how the SpaceBudz marketplace works. They explain how eUTxO accounting works, why it's different from account balance type systems like Ethereum and Solana. And then they get into specifics of how the smart contracts running the SpaceBudz marketplace works. This diagram alone is really great for people to understand how a UTXO system works. But where it gets really interesting is when they get into the details about how the SpaceBudz marketplace works. This diagram right here pretty much explains everything. If you can look, the only additional piece you need is that piece that was described by Robert Kornacki of DC Spark in an article he wrote. The gist of that article was that every single dApp in Cardano was going to use NFTs, which is an interesting and captivating title because a lot of people read that and think about sort of art NFTs and profile pic NFTs, and they don't understand why every dApp would need them. Of course, that's not at all what he's talking about. Robert explains that there's a problem in that it's not a problem, it's a condition. There's a condition of this eUTxO system that anyone can create a UTXO at the address of a smart contract. And we've talked before at this channel how that's kind of a colloquialism when we say a UTXO is at a smart contract address, because really the Plutus scripts involved in that smart contract are attached to the UTXO, not the other way around. We don't need to get into that right now. We've talked about it before on this channel, but the important part is anybody can create a UTXO and make it look like it's associated with that smart contract. We don't want that, because if anybody can create a UTXO, they can change the data in the UTXO, because UTXO can contain assets like ADA or NFTs. It can contain Plutus scripts, and it can contain data. So because anyone can change the data in that UTXO, they can change the state of that UTXO, and they could use that to create an exploit of the smart contract. We don't want that, of course. So Robert Kornacki described an easy solution. The solution is you just put an NFT in the UTXOs that you want to be distinguished as the legit ones, not the fake ones, as SpaceBudz put it here. So you put these NFTs into the UTXOs that are going to be the legit UTXOs associated with that smart contract. And then the smart contract will only let you use UTXOs containing those NFTs with that smart contract. That's exactly what SpaceBudz is doing here. And they're also using distributed UTXOs. So SpaceBudz, we talked about this when we talked about the concurrency items. So SpaceBudz, we talked about how there are basically two big families that I know of. There are two big families of solutions. One is to use centralized off-chain bots and stuff like that. The other way is to use distributed UTXOs. SpaceBudz, of course, is going the distributed UTXO route. They are creating 10,000 bid UTXOs. So these are UTXOs containing an NFT that SpaceBudz is calling the SpaceBud bid NFT. And it's going to be SpaceBud bid and then an ID for that NFT. So they created 10,000 of these. Those are for the buyers to use so that the contract knows that's a legit UTXO for a buyer to use with that smart contract. You're asking yourself, what about the sellers? Of course, we don't need special NFTs on the other side, because any seller who's legitimately using the SpaceBud Plutus scripts is going to have a SpaceBud, and that will be the NFT that will be recognized by the contract in order to do seller stuff inside the smart contract. So the SpaceBudz marketplace smart contract is doing exactly those things we've talked about with respect to concurrency and all the other issues in eUTxO smart contracts. They're using distributed UTXOs so that multiple people can be involved with the smart contract, and they're using NFTs in that way that was exactly described by Robert Kornacki previously that we covered. And I'm sure a lot of other people were thinking about these, but I'm just citing the first occasion where I saw somebody describe using NFTs to distinguish the legit eUTxOs that are associated with the smart contract. What was really magical for me was this piece right here. Here's the actual validator written in Plutus, which you already know is just a subset of Haskell. So over the last couple of years, I've spent a little time trying to teach myself Haskell for purposes of Cardano so that I would understand Plutus better. And I pretty much just assumed I was the worst Haskell learner ever, and definitely asked myself a lot of questions about whether or not all that time was worth it. I basically went through a couple of smaller, maybe one or two smaller Haskell courses that were kind of more in the flavor of an overview. And then I went through that giant 1,200 page book that Charles recommends. I got 400 and change pages in, but I was both reading it and doing all the homework. And the homework was pretty extensive. I mean, it's a pretty serious of course. But even having finished that, I was kind of asking myself, did I actually learn anything useful? I wrote a bunch of functions in Haskell and functions that interact with other functions. And I kind of understand how all that works. And I understand a little bit about the syntax of Haskell. And I understand a little bit generally about functional programming. But will this ever actually benefit me in Cardano? I wasn't really sure until I read this article, to be honest. Having read this, I came to this section where they lay out the actual validator for their SpaceBudz marketplace. And as I stared at it and sort of started parsing all of these lines of code, I realized that I actually understand what's going on here. I still think I'm probably the worst Haskell learner ever, and I would be unable to create anything like this. But definitely I can say in the course of those 400 pages of Haskell, I definitely was forced in the homework to create stuff, pretty similar to this, doing, and, I haven't touched the Haskell stuff in months and months for sure. But as I kind of reminded myself how that syntax worked and started looking more closely at this, I realized that I actually understand what's going on here. And as soon as I realized what was going on here, I realized that we're going to be just fine. There was all this concern over how concurrency was going to work in an eUTxO system and whether or not we'd be able to run big markets. After looking at this, we're going to be A-okay, guys. So it may be that I'm about to make a bunch of mistakes because, like I said, I'm just a Haskell beginner, and it could be that I'm the world's worst Haskell beginner. But when I look at these lines of code, a lot of this makes sense to me. I mean, here we have a function called trade validate, and it is of type that you have inputs, contract info, trade datum, trade action, script context, and an output of bool, which is just some Boolean, so true or false. And it's kind of confusing in Haskell because they use arrow, like this is an input, this is an input, this is an input, this is an input, and then they use the same arrow and they're like, okay, the last one's an output. You just need to know that. Why Haskell doesn't use a different symbol right here is a question I think a lot of Haskell beginners like me ask, but this is the output and this is the input. And then you have a definition of the actual function. They say, hey, the function is this. It has a bunch of these inputs, like was defined up here in the typing, has these inputs, and then you have some cases of things, right? So we have three states in blue here. SpaceBudz tells us we have start bid, we have bid, and we have offer. Those are the only three states that are happening in this smart contract. This makes sense if we go to the How It Works page at SpaceBudz.io. So there's only four things that can happen. There's sort of two things buyers can do and two things sellers can do. So a buyer can place a bid on any SpaceBud. A seller can offer to sell any SpaceBud. A buyer can go to one of these listings of a SpaceBud that's been offered by its seller, and the buyer can buy it, or a seller who owns a SpaceBud upon which a buyer has placed a bid can accept that bid and sell their SpaceBud. Here's where it gets cool. Those four things are the state transitions laid out in green here under the only three possible states. So if your state is start bid, the only thing that can happen next is bid higher. If you've bid higher leads to you being in the state of bid. If you're in the state of bid, the only three things that can happen are bid higher than the previous bid. The seller accepts the bid and sells, or the buyer cancels the bid. If you've got a seller who is offering to sell their SpaceBud, there's only two things that can happen. The seller can cancel, they can decide not to sell, or a buyer can come along and pay the price requested in the offer to sell and actually buy the SpaceBud. Here's what's cool about the way Haskell and Plutus work. So under each of these, you've got these state transitions. And basically what this code is telling us is, hey, in order for this to resolve to true, you've got to have this, and then you've got this double ampersand, which means this plus the next thing. And then this one is like, okay, all that plus the next thing. It's got another double ampersand. Then this one is like plus the next thing. And so with bid higher, you've got a bunch of things that have to be true for the entire thing to resolve to be true in order for us to make the state transition to bid higher, which just brings us back to bid. We know that from our little flow chart. But in this case, to bid higher, the one thing you need is for the bid to be signed by the, here we go, transaction signed by, to be signed by the buyer. If it's a sell, remember a sell is when the seller decides to accept the bid and seller SpaceBud. We have, again, four things. We've got the double ampersands, which mean all this has to resolve to be true, and then the whole thing is true, and we have a sell. And again, it has to be signed, but in this case, it has to be signed by the seller in order to sell. And we've got some additional interesting stuff. Here's where the NFT thing comes in. So when we're attempting to have a sell of the SpaceBud, we have to have this little bit here contains policy bid NFT. So it contains that NFT we talked about, the what is it called? SpaceBud bid, I think they called it. So this line, I believe, is confirming that the eUTxO being used, that was used to make the bid, that's going to be the winning bid here, actually contains the NFT that was one of those 10,000 NFTs that were laid out by SpaceBudz to be to discern the legit UTXOs that are associated with the smart contract. On the other side, on the seller side, we're checking to make sure that they actually have a SpaceBud to sell. If we go back up here and look at bid higher, where the buyer's just making another bid, we see this same little bit here, contains policy bid NFT. So the smart contract is going to check, does the UTXO that is involved with this bid, does that UTXO have the NFT that we use to discern the legit UTXOs? If so, then it all resolves to be true. Because remember, we have the double ampersands here. That means that everything has to resolve to true. And again, down here, both of these are included because everything has double ampersand. So all this has to resolve to be true. It has to have the SpaceBudz bid NFT, and the seller actually has to have the SpaceBud itself. Down here to cancel, if the buyer, since we're in bid, if the buyer is going to cancel their bid, it just checks to be sure that it's going to look for the signature of the buyer to cancel their bid. And we're also going to check to be sure that this is a legit UTXO in the nomenclature of SpaceBudz here by checking to be sure it has one of those 10,000 SpaceBudz bid NFTs. If we go down here on the seller side, here's where it gets kind of interesting. And this is the moment when I realized that having, whatever small amount of Haskell, I don't even want to call it experience, but exposure to Haskell was helping me out. Because over here we see this is in the offer sort of arm of the smart contract. This is when a seller is offering to sell their SpaceBud. So the seller is kind of initiating everything. So then when a buyer comes along, look at this. We have the same double ampersands, but we only have 3 lines. Why is that? Why are there only 3 lines? It's because we're only checking to see if the seller has the SpaceBud. there's no contains policy bid NFT. There's no line that's checking to see if the buyer is using a legit UTXO that contains that SpaceBud bid NFT. Why is that? Immediately, this kind of jumped out at me. I was like, whoa, what's going on here? Why are we not checking? Don't we want to make sure the buyer is using a legit UTXO involved with that's associated with the smart contract? We don't really care. I got thinking about it. I don't think we care, because as long as they pay the price that's being asked by the seller, remember, this is the side of the smart contract where the seller is offering their SpaceBud for sale. As long as the buyer is going to pay the right price, and that's what this piece checks, requested amount is greater than or equal to min price. And of course, all these little functions you see here, these are all defined somewhere else. This is referencing other bits of code that we don't have in front of us here. It's all available in the GitHub listed at the bottom of this article, though, at the SpaceBudz Medium page. So requested amount must be greater than or equal to min price. That's all the seller cares about, because there's not really going to be any state here in terms of this bid being higher than the previous bid. Over here in the bid state, where we've got this bid higher, we've got this bid higher state transition where somebody's going to come along and they're going to bid higher than the previous bid. Even with the starting bid, you use bid higher to kind of place your first bid. So when the seller offers at a given price, they just say, hey, I'm going to sell my SpaceBud for X number of ADA. The seller doesn't really care if they're outbidding anybody else. If they meet that price that the seller is offering it for, that's all we care about. We don't care if they use a UTXO that's legitly associated with smart contract, or they just create their own UTXO, because all the seller cares about and all the platform cares about in this case is if the seller actually gets the minimum price they paid for. And the only other state transition over here is one that can be made by the seller, and that's to cancel their offer to sell a SpaceBud, to cancel their listing. And that just has to be signed by the seller. So there's only one line of code. So we've got these various state transitions, and the Haskell code tells us really concisely how each thing happens. It's like, hey, we're just going to have a bunch of things, all of which must be true, and we're just going to lay them out. And in the most complicated one here, we still only have these two both have 4 lines of code. But in the most complicated one, we're just going to have a line to check that the seller has a SpaceBud and a line to check that the buyer is using a UTXO with the NFT that tells us that that UTXO is legitly associated with the smart contract. Very beautiful, elegant, and concise. I love this. And down below here, if you have no interest in looking at this Plutus Haskell code up here, basically, they have little flowcharts that tell you exactly how this works in each of these cases. Here's what it looks like when you start bidding. Here's what it looks like when you are bidding higher. See, there's the state transition, bid higher. Down here, this is when you offer. So you create a listing and offer. Here's how you cancel a bid. Here's how you cancel a listing. Here's how you buy. And here's how you sell. Those are those 4 state transitions we talked about. Here is a big summary graphic that shows you a little bit more condensed version of how all those things work. This was all theory a couple weeks ago. We were looking at people's proposed concurrency solutions, and we were just sort of talking about how a dApp like this would work in the future. It was like, hey, we've got answers to concurrency. One of them is using distributed UTXOs. And the Kornacki article came along, and he was like, hey, we don't need to worry about people creating fake UTXOs at the smart contract address. Again, that's just a sort of colloquialism to say that the UTXO is at the smart contract address, but everybody knows what we mean when we say that. We don't have to worry about that, because we'll just put NFTs in the UTXOs that are legitimately associated with the smart contract. That was all just sort of like theory a couple of weeks ago. Of course, these projects were all working on this, but it's no longer theory. Right here, SpaceBudz is telling us that's exactly what they did, and their project is already up and running. So the next time somebody tells you, hey, I don't believe Cardano has a solution to concurrency, I don't believe that Cardano smart contracts are really working, please direct me, sarcastically they was asked, please direct me to your favorite Cardano dApp. Go ahead and send them to SpaceBudz, and SpaceBudz lays out for them right here exactly how it all works. There's basically only like, there's 3 states and like 4 different things that can happen in the SpaceBudz marketplace, and they lay out the code telling you exactly how they validate all those things that can happen. I was super psyched to see this, super happy to see that my Haskell at least leads me to believe that I know a little bit more about what's going on than I did a couple years ago when I was thinking about Plutus smart contracts. Again, like I said, I'm just a Haskell beginner, and I may be the world's worst Haskell beginner. So I may have made some mistakes there, but I feel like that's a good representation of my meager understanding of Haskell and of Plutus. Super excited to see this article, and I will talk to you tomorrow.